I remember distinctly in the sixth wing in the Long Bay, you had this guy, and there was a queue up to the cell, you know, a bunch of lifers and deviates had him sort of in the cell, and you had one guy be screwing him, another one would be getting a head job off him and things, one's getting a hand job off him, and they just sort of want to go in, want to go out, and they just all day he'd spend his life, this guy, in different wings, in different cells, just going from cell to cell, you know, like getting screwed or sucking another guy off and things like that. And sort of people don't worry about AIDS when it comes to that stage, you know. They think, most people think, oh yeah, you're only going to get AIDS if he bleeds, you know, if you sort of split his backside and he bleeds or something like that.
Most prisoners, in fact, are heterosexual, and many of them are married and have female sexual contacts, and may only practice homosexual contacts while they're in prison. So present a fairly major potential problem of spreading the disease into the general population through their female sexual partners.
We are concerned about the spread of AIDS, but at the same time, there is ways that you don't spread the disease in jail. I mean, if you don't want to get AIDS, then you don't use other people's needles. You don't use needles at all. And if you're concerned about homosexual practices, then and you're concerned about getting AIDS through homosexual practices, then if you don't indulge in homosexual practices, then you won't contract AIDS that way.
If only it were that easy. The plea for celibacy ignores a simple, violent reality of prison life. Often, all too often, it's not an indulgence, it is demanded. It is enforced.
I know I've had sex with 4 or 5 prisoners forcefully, and about 2 not forcefully. And I don't know whether I've contracted disease from them or from the outside, where I was really fussy who I choose, what partner I had, and very careful on the outside. But in jail it's practically impossible. If the guy's bigger than you or stronger than you, he'll soon stand over you, force sex and rape you, and you can contract it from that.
In the world outside, medical opinion says the first lines of defense against AIDS are condoms and sterile syringes. But in this world inside, where the risk of AIDS infection may be higher than almost anywhere else, those defenses are noble. Their provision presents prison authorities with a dilemma for which they have no answer. To provide condoms would be to acknowledge the rampant homosexuality which so often has been denied. To issue clean syringes would be to admit that for all the rules, all the discipline, all the searches, authority has failed to keep drugs out of its prisons.
Well, in regards to the issuing of syringes, it's our function to prevent drugs in jail. It's our function to attempt to find drugs, and it's our function that when we find the drugs, that the prisoner who has the drug is charged. Now, if you are going to administer needles to him as a policy, then you might as well say that it is now legal for prisoners to have illegal drugs in jail, because if you're supplying him with the instruments to inject the heroin into his veins, then you simply cannot, if you find him with heroin in his cell or on his person.
We've now reached a stage in the epidemic where many of our attitudes towards homosexuality, intravenous drug users, have to be put aside in the light of knowing that the AIDS epidemic is about to spread into the general community, and therefore we have to find ways of stopping that, and issuing of needles and condoms to the appropriate groups are the best way we know of stopping the spread of the disease.
the relationship between prison officers and prisoners is absolutely fundamental. No amount of psychologists and psychiatrists, no amount of prison reform will change if prison officers do not start changing their views about their role and attempting to relate to prisoners in a humane, educative manner. At the moment, prison officers simply see themselves as security people who have to keep prisoners down, and that, I think, basically stops any worthwhile prison reform.
And there's no question that we do have an image problem, but what to do about it is a very, very difficult one as far as we're concerned, because people have made up their minds quite clearly on a prison officer, and I think it's pretty well black and white as far as they're concerned. I think Australians do have a hostile attitude towards law enforcement, people in general, be they prison officers or police officers, and I think it goes back to the settlement of the country. Not without good reason, of course, that people were brutalised in those days, but I don't believe that the prison system is about brutalising people today, and I think certainly the role of the prison officer is very, very much misunderstood by the public generally.
Officers are spat at, swore. Constantly prisoners are swearing at officers. Officers are told under no circumstances are they to swear at prisoners. Yet we suffer from this problem from prisoners on a day-to-day basis.
The situation that is here is that you're a scumbag if you don't do something for a prisoner, and you're a weak scumbag if you do something for a prisoner. Favours, like you phone up his remuneration, you cut red tape, it's a favour. If they have to do something, they have to go on a request, and it's long, it's drawn out, it's time consuming. You can take a shortcut, but that's a favour. You do the favour, you're weak. You don't do the favour, you're not liked at all. You're a scumbag.
We do have an officer here, one in particular who stands right out. He goes to the cells of a night time to count the heads, a head count they call it, which is to see the bodies in the cell. As he goes to each cell, instead of saying an inmate or counting, he's saying is maggot here, another maggot here, there's another maggot here. So he's got us all as maggots, not as prisoners, not as anything else. He set up his own system, whereas we are maggots.
Most prison officers adopt the policy that if a prisoner is reasonable to him, he will be reasonable to the prisoner, and he will attend to any requirements that he's entitled to. If a prisoner wants to be a troublemaker, wants to adopt an arrogant attitude, a threatening attitude, as many of them do, then we certainly will not go out of our way to help him.
You can't trust a prison officer, and there are guys in prison who do trust prison officers and chat to them, but they usually find out as soon as there's a riot that same guy will come in with a baton and will really go berserk and let out all his aggression and all his pent-up sort of psychological traumas that he's having at home. He'll take it out on you with a baton, you know. Maybe his missus has just left him or something, you know, and I've seen them, you know, I've been hit myself with the batons, and they go overboard. You know, some of the prison officers, that's not all of them, you know, but some of them really go overboard. They really get carried away, you know, they have to be dragged off by the other prison officers from beating prisoners, otherwise they'd beat them to death.
If we have a prison officer who is new to the job and he shows humane tendencies to encourage the inmates to respect him, to admire him, then he is called a criminal by his contemporaries. And if he doesn't change his attitude, he won't stay with the prison department very long.
Rule 5A states what? Right, Mr. Flanagan, could you state Rule 5A?
We've got a set of rules and guidelines that we've got to work to, and when we come through the training they are pumped into our head, you know, and we've got to sit down an exam and write down the rules and regulations, and we've got to know them.
We come in with a job, we try to enforce them, and if you try and enforce them straight down the line, 9 times out of 10 you're going to get a smack in the mouth from a crim.
The first time in jail can be a shock for the trainee officer almost as much as for the first-time prisoner. This day will be the first test of the enthusiasm and ideals they've brought to the job.
The CIP was a different experience altogether. Nothing completely different to what I expected. I really wasn't prepared for it. It's not often you can walk, every time you take a step someone shouts some different sort of abuse at you. Now, that's a bit hard to take. Some of the abuse would was say you're going to be maggots, are you, or that sort of thing. So they all knew exactly why we were there and everything. They'd obviously seen it all before.
When they come into these jails, they'll find old, antiquated jails, 100 years old, with very little work being done on them. They'll be working under appalling working conditions, and they'll find that there's very little money being spent to improve those conditions.
Most of the stress in this job is caused by the fact that the majority of prisons in Victoria are over 100 years old. There have been many new policies come out that have made the job much easier, but they're still trying to run a 20th century prison system with 19th century accommodation. The environment that staff and prisoners have to work in does brutalise.
It's hard to get prison staff, harder still to keep them. The attrition rate is enormous, so the entry standards are relaxed and relaxed again.
In the newspapers, they virtually advertise for prison officers in terms of, are you over 45 and unemployable? There is a new and interesting job in corrective services. You know, stand on a tower for 2 weeks at a time and do very little. No, the whole approach seems to me quite amazing.
You've got all sorts as prisoners. You've got all sorts as officers. There are some prisoners that would make very good officers, and there are some officers that would make very ordinary prisoners.
There are many similarities between prison officers and prisoners. They would no doubt hate to hear that, but the prison staff are locked in the prison many hours of the day as well, and they're affected by the institutional environment, and that obviously has a flow-on effect on their home lives. Prison officers have a stigma attached to them because they're what the public see as prison screws, and that has a name to the public, and that's very similar to the situation that prisoners are in. They have a bad name by being prisoners. The staff have to wear a prison uniform, prisoners have to wear a prison uniform. Their educational levels in the main are not dissimilar. They often have very black and white attitudes towards philosophical things. And there are a group of prison officers who, in parallel with prisoners, see that the resolution of major problems are sorted out in the car park after work.